All right, well, thanks again for having me, especially those who are returning customers. It's an honor to be here to be giving these talks at the Young Philosophers Lecture Series. So tonight, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to defend a view that's known as incompatibilism. So let me first tell you what incompatibilism is, and then I'll spend the next 30 or 40 minutes trying to convince you that it's true. So sometimes in philosophy, incompatibilism can refer to two theses. One thesis it might refer to is the view that determinism and free will are incompatible. So determinism is very roughly the idea that given what's happened in the past, and given what the laws of nature are, everything has to happen just the way it did. Right? So it's the thought that the past and the laws of nature determine a unique future. What is free will? Well, that's a big one. No one really agrees what free will is, but we can think of it roughly as the power to do otherwise than you do, or having a choice about what you do, or it's being up to you. So you think, maybe an hour or so ago you were deliberating about what you were going to do this evening. You said, well, maybe on the one hand I can stay home and watch this cool movie that I've been wanting to watch, and on the other hand I could come hear Justin's talk on incompatibilism. And you think it's up to me, right? So you chose to come to the talk, but you could have chosen differently and stayed home and watched the movie. That's roughly the idea of free will. There may be some other niceties and some things about that way of viewing it that people would want to dispute, but that's how we can think of it for tonight's purposes. So on this way of understanding incompatibilism is the view that if determinism is true, then no one ever has free will or performs any free actions. That's one thing we might mean. Another thing that we might mean by incompatibilism is the claim that determinism rules out moral responsibility. So here the thought is that if determinism is true, then no one's really morally responsible for what they do, so they can't justifiably be praised or blamed. And I'm going to be mainly focusing on this second kind of incompatibilism, the incompatibilism of determinism and moral responsibility. And I'll be focused even more particularly on blameworthiness. Right? So the idea that we can sort of be angry at people or resent them for the bad things that we do, and that we might be justified in doing that. So essentially what I'm going to argue that if determinism is true, in other words, if the universe is a physically deterministic system, then no one is ever blameworthy for any of their bad actions. Now, I'll also at the end try to convince you that if you accept my argument for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility, you should also be convinced that determinism rules out free will as well. So I'll start by giving an argument for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility, and then I'll show that if you're convinced by that argument, it's a very short step to the conclusion that determinism also rules out the power to do otherwise than you actually do. All right, so we know what incompatibilism is now. There are some arguments for incompatibilism that rely centrally on what are sometimes known as transfer of non-responsibility principles. And these are principles that purport to identify circumstances in which lack of responsibility for one event or state of affairs transfers to the consequences or the outcome of that event or state of affairs. So I'm going to develop an argument for incompatibilism of that sort, a sort that depends on one of these transfer of non-responsibility principles. So maybe by way of doing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by raising some problems with some existing arguments of this sort, and then I'm going to provide an argument that sort of fixes those problems with these other arguments. So I'm going to start with an argument of a philosopher named Peter van Inwagen that's come to be known as the direct argument. So Van Inwagen's presentation of his direct argument for incompatibilism is a little complicated, and so I'm going to try to simplify it for us a little bit. So let's start with some abbreviations. Let's let the letter A stand for a proposition describing some action or omission of yours. So you slapped somebody across the face, or you came to a talk, or you watched a movie, or you failed to pull a child out of a pond when she was drowning. That would be an example of some actions or omissions that we might perform. Let's let H stand for a proposition describing the complete state of the universe at some time in the distant past. So 1 million years ago, before human beings ever existed, H is a proposition that describes the entire state of the universe at that time. Then let's let L stand for a conjunction of all the laws of nature. All right. So using these abbreviations, here's a version of Van Inwagen's direct argument. So if determinism is true, then it's necessarily the case that the conjunction of H and L implies A. In other words, if determinism is true, it's necessarily the case that given the past and the laws of nature, you perform that action A. So that's just a consequence of determinism. Now, Van Inwagen claims, and I think it's a very plausible claim, that no one is even partly to blame for necessary truths. So if something is a necessary truth, then that's not your fault, right? You can't be blamed for it. Right? Well, it's necessary that the conjunction of H and L imply A. And if no one's even partly to blame for necessary truths, it's going to follow that you're not to blame for the fact that the conjunction of H and L implies A. That's not your fault. It's a necessary truth. All right. Now, you're also not to even partly to blame for the conjunction of H and L. In other words, it's not your fault that the universe was the way it was 1 million years ago, and it's not your fault what the laws of nature are. Right? You can't be blamed for those. All right. So now we have a transfer of non-responsibility principle. Here's what that principle says. If you're not even partly to the blame for the fact that P, where P can stand for any proposition, and you're also not even partly to blame for the fact that P implies Q, then you're not even partly to blame for Q either. That's the transfer of non-responsibility principle that Van Inwagen uses. So notice, if 3, 4, and 5 are true, it's going to follow that you're not even partly to blame for the fact that A, where remember A again stands for a proposition describing some action or omission of yours. So it's going to follow from these 3, 4, and 5 that you're not even partly to blame for A. Now A is just any proposition describing any action or omission of yours. We could fill in any action, anything you do or fail to do, and we'd get the same result. So the argument generalizes. So the thought is, if determinism is true, you're not to blame for anything you did or anything you failed to do. And if you're not to blame for anything you did or failed to do, then you're not to blame for anything. Okay? So that's the basic gist of what's sometimes called the direct argument. I'll explain a little later why it's called the direct argument. All right, so this is Van Inwagen's argument. Now, notice all of the steps in the argument look really plausible. The first step is just a consequence of determinism. So we're trying to show that determinism rules out moral responsibility, so we assume that determinism is true for the sake of argument. So given that assumption, 1 has to be true. 2, the claim that no one's even partly to blame for necessary truths, that looks really plausible too. I mean, it's a necessary truth that 2 + 2 = 4. Surely you're not to blame for that. It's a necessary truth that the water bottle can't be green all over and red all over at the same time. That's not your fault. So that looks plausible too. The third step, that looks really plausible. It's definitely not your fault the way the world was 1 million years ago, and it's definitely not your fault what the laws of nature are. So if there's a problem with this argument, it's going to have to be with this transfer of non-responsibility principle. And most people think that there is a problem with this principle. And I'm inclined to agree, although there's some technical questions here that we might talk about in the question and answer session. But I think there's at least a prima facie problem with this principle, and so I'll try to point out what it is. So I'm going to try to give a counterexample to this principle. So I'm going to try to give an example in which it's true that you're not to blame for P. It's true that you're not to blame for the fact that P implies Q. Nevertheless, the person in the example is going to be to blame for Q. But before I do that, let me give an example that Van Inwagen uses to try to illustrate why he thinks this is true. So here's the example. Suppose John is bitten by a cobra on his 30th birthday. It's a bad birthday. And suppose no one is morally responsible for that fact. It's no one's fault that John got bitten by the cobra on his 30th birthday. Suppose it's also true that if John is bitten by a cobra on his 30th birthday, then he dies on his 30th birthday. Suppose that's true, and suppose no one is even partly morally responsible for that fact either. So we have no one's to blame for the fact that John's bitten by the cobra. No one's to blame for the fact that if he's bitten by the cobra, then he dies that day. It seems to follow from those two assumptions that no one's to blame for the fact that John dies on his 30th birthday. Right? So when we reflect on examples like this transfer of non-responsibility principle seems pretty plausible. Now, the story about John that I've told is sometimes referred to as a one-path case. And the reason why it's called a one-path case is because there's only one sort of causal pathway to his death, right? He gets bitten by the cobra, and that's what leads to his demise on his 30th birthday. So there's one causal stream or one causal sequence. But a lot of people have thought that if we reflect on cases that have multiple causal paths leading to the same outcome, then we can get counterexamples to this transfer of non-responsibility principle. And I think that's probably right. And so I'm going to try to give at least a two-path counterexample to this principle. So here's the counterexample. We can call this story double dose. So here's the story. By the way, Kathy and Earl were the name of my parents, but this is pure fiction. It doesn't resemble anything. They love each other to death. All right, at noon, Kathy deliberately injects Earl with a deadly poison for which there is no antidote, with the intention of thereby killing him. I know you would never do this, Mom. The poison, let's suppose, takes about 10 minutes to kill. So by giving Earl the poison at noon, Kathy guarantees that Earl will meet his untimely end at 12:10. All right. However, at 12:05, Earl accidentally ingests a second deadly substance. And this second deadly substance, let's suppose, it only takes 5 minutes to kill. So by ingesting the second substance at 12:05, well, given relevant background conditions and the laws of nature, it's guaranteed that he's going to die at 12:10. All right. Now let's suppose that both the poison with which Kathy injected Earl at noon and the second poison that he encountered at 12:05 causally contribute to Earl's demise at 12:10. Suppose that's the case. Well, this looks to me like a counterexample to that transfer of non-responsibility principle, and here's why. Let's suppose that no one is even partly to blame for the fact that Earl came into contact with that second deadly substance at 12:05. It was just an accident. It's no one's fault. No one's to blame for that. Let's also suppose, very plausibly, that no one's to blame for the fact that if Earl comes into contact with that second deadly substance at 12:05, then he dies at 12:10. Now, if both those assumptions are true, then it should be the case, according to Van Inwagen's transfer of non-responsibility principle, that no one's even partly to blame for the fact that Earl dies at 12:10. So no one's responsible for P, no one's responsible for the fact that P implies Q, then no one's responsible for Q either. And here we have a case, no one's responsible for the fact that Earl ingests the second deadly substance at 12:05. No one's even partly responsible for the fact that if he ingests that substance at 12:05, then he dies at 12:10. So if the transfer of non-responsibility principle were right, it should follow that no one's even partly to blame for the fact that Earl dies at 12:10. But somebody's definitely to blame for the fact that Earl dies at 12:10, namely Kathy. It seems like she's at least partly responsible for his death. After all, she gave him a poison, intending to kill him, right? Knowing, right, we can suppose that it took 10 minutes to kill. Killing him was exactly what she wanted to do. We can even imagine that she wanted to kill him precisely at 12:10. At 12:10, and maybe that's why she gave him the poison precisely at noon. She did this of her own free will. It's a direct and foreseeable consequence of her action. It looks like she's partly to blame. And if she is, well then Van Inwagen's transfer of non-responsibility principle can't be right, which means his argument for incompatibilism shouldn't be regarded as a good or a convincing argument. All right, so this looks like a problem with Van Inwagen's direct argument. Now, several people have tried to do what I'm trying to do tonight, try to come up with improvements, right, way to get around these sorts of objections. I'll consider one of those attempts, and I'll explain how, in just a second, how this second direct argument is supposed to improve on the first one we just looked at. But let me lay out the argument first. So, again, it's a consequence of determinism that H and L, the conjunction of those two claims, entails A. So remember, H is a proposition describing the state of the world in the distant past, long before humans existed. L is a conjunction of the laws of nature, and A, some claim about some action that you performed. So if determinism is true, the conjunction of A and L entails A. All right. Well, you're not even partly to blame for H and L. We've already sort of seen that. That seems plausible. It's not your fault the way the world was 1,000,000 years ago. It's not your fault what the laws of nature are. So that you're not to blame for that. Now here's a new transfer of non-responsibility principle. That's sometimes called beta box. And it says, if you're not even partly to blame for P, and P entails Q, then you're not even partly to blame for Q either. So that's a sort of transfer of non-responsibility principle, because it says, if you're not responsible for this fact, and this fact leads to this other fact, then you're not to blame for the second fact either. All right. So if all these claims are true, it's going to follow that you're not even partly to blame for A. And again, we can replace A with any claim about any action or omission of yours. So it seems like this is a good argument for the conclusion that you're not to blame for A if determinism is true. It looks like we can replicate it and show that you're not to blame for anything if determinism is true. And what's true for you goes for me as well. The argument generalizes to show that determinism rules out moral responsibility. All right. So Ted Warfield, who came up with this argument, thinks that it improves upon that first argument of Van Inwagen's that we just looked at. And I won't go into detail on why he thinks this, but the sort of short version of the story is that there are certain two-path cases. So we just looked at one two-path case, double dose, right? So there's two causal pathways to Earl's death. The one is the poison that Kathy injected him with. The other starts with the poison that he ingested at 12:05 accidentally. So two causal pathways. There are other two causal pathways stories in the literature on this subject. And it seems like this transfer of non-responsibility principle is not threatened by these other two-path cases. Right? So that would be nice, right? If those other two-path cases do show that the transfer of non-responsibility principle is false, and they don't show that this is false, then this argument would survive those objections. That's why this is supposed to be an improvement. And I think in some of the two-path cases, this principle beta box is not threatened by them. They're not counterexamples to this principle. But I think that story that I just told you about double dose is a counterexample to this principle, or at least it provides the materials. All right, so here's how I think it does that. So this first claim is true in the story double dose. If we combine, or the conjunction of L plus the relevant background conditions, plus Earl ingesting the second poison at 12:05, all those things conjoined entail that Earl dies at 12:10. Right? So it's impossible for those first three things to be true, and yet it be false that Earl dies at 12:10. So that's true. This second claim is also true in my story double dose. Kathy is not even partly to blame for this really long conjunction. She's not to blame for the conjunction of L, the state of the world at 12:05, and Earl ingests that second poison at 12:05. She's not morally responsible for that. All right, so if beta box were valid, it should follow that no one is even partly morally responsible for the fact that Earl dies at 12:10. But again, we've already seen that someone is morally responsible for the fact that Earl dies at 12:10. Kathy's to blame for that fact. And she's to blame for that fact even though she's not responsible for this long conjunction right here. And even though this long conjunction entails that Earl dies at 12:10. So I think this story, Double Dose, provides a counterexample to beta box as well. And it also provides a counterexample to Van Inwagen's transfer of non-responsibility principle. So I think that both of these direct arguments are probably unsound. Like I said, there's some technical points that maybe could be raised against my attempt to provide a counterexample to these principles. But probably these principles are false. And even if they're not, I think reflection on cases like Double Dose causes enough problems, right? Raises enough doubt about the validity of those principles that we might try to think and see if there's a better transfer of non-responsibility principle that we could use to argue for incompatibilism. And that's what I'll try to do for the rest of the talk. All right, so how do we transfer non-responsibility the right way? Well, again, there's some complex details that we needn't go into, but here's a rough sketch. So let's call this principle TNR star, transfer of non-responsibility star. It says, if you're not even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to some outcome O, and you're not even partly to blame for the fact that those circumstances led to that particular outcome, then you're not to blame for that outcome. So this is, again, a transfer of non-responsibility principle because it tells us, gives us a set of circumstances where lack of responsibility for one event or state of affairs transfers to the consequences of that state of affairs. So it's in the same family of principles, but I think it's an improvement over the other two transfer of non-responsibility principles that we've looked at. And I also think that you can use it in a pretty powerful argument for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility. All right, so let's start with this principle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first explain why this principle isn't threatened by examples like Double Dose. And then I'll try to say a little bit about to persuade you that the principle is true. So here's why Double Dose isn't a counterexample to this principle. So the relevant outcome in Double Dose is Earl's dying at 12:10. That's the relevant outcome. So this principle says that if you're not even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to that outcome, and you're not even partly to blame for the fact that those circumstances led to that outcome, then you're not to blame for the outcome. But notice that Kathy is at least partly to blame for some of the circumstances that led to Earl's dying at 12:10. Right? She's to blame for her act of poisoning him. And that's one event that's among the causes of Earl's dying at 12:10. So we can't apply this principle to Kathy's case because this first part isn't true. If you're not even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to O. So that part of the principle isn't satisfied in Double Dose. She is partly to blame for some of the causes, some of the events and states of affairs that led to Earl's dying at 12:10. Right? And that's partly why she's to blame for the outcome of Earl's dying at 12:10. So you're not going to be able to get a counterexample to TNR star using these two-path cases like Double Dose. And I haven't been able to find any other two-path cases that pose a threat to this either. So this avoids the objections to TNR and to beta box. But that's not yet to say it's true, right? It might be better than those principles, but it might still be false. And here's a challenge for you guys. What you should be thinking about is you should be trying to come up with cases for the question and answer session, right, in which the if clause is true, and yet the then clause is false, right? And if you could come up with an example like that, well, then you will have refuted my argument. But I've been thinking for at least 2 years to try to come up with a case. So that's not to say that you can't do so, but it would be awesome if you could. All right. So why should we think this principle is true? Well, one reason is because it's really hard to come up with a counterexample. I mean, that's some evidence in its favor. But I also think that we've got some very powerful intuitions in favor of this principle. So let me give you a few examples. Suppose very sadly that a little toddler named Todd has contracted malaria, and we want to know whether his mom is even partly to blame for the fact that he's contracted malaria. So that's our question. Is Todd's mother even partly to blame for his contracting malaria? Well, suppose that she's not even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to Todd's contracting malaria. Suppose also that she's not even partly to blame for the fact that those circumstances led to his contracting malaria. Well, then it's really hard to see how she could be to blame for the fact that he has malaria. She's not to blame for any of the causes of his contracting the disease. She's not to blame for the fact that those causes led to his getting the disease. So it seems very plausible to say that she's not even partly to blame for the fact that her toddler has this terrible disease. Here's another case. Suppose Mr. Wilson's window has been shattered to bits by an errant baseball. Suppose we want to know whether the next door neighbor's kid, Dennis, is even partly to blame for the fact that Mr. Wilson's window has been shattered to bits. So we ask, is Dennis even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to Mr. Wilson's window breaking? Suppose the answer is no. He's not to blame for any of the circumstances that led to the window breaking. Then we ask, well, is he to blame for the fact that the circumstances that led to the window's breaking did in fact lead to its breaking? Suppose the answer to that question is no. Well, it seems very plausible to say that Dennis is off the hook, right? Mr. Wilson can't blame him for his window being shattered to bits. So when we reflect on examples like this, something like this TNR star principle seems very plausible. I also think this principle has some advantages over even further transfer of non-responsibility principles that have been presented in the literature. So, for instance, Eleanor Stump has argued that the original transfer of non-responsibility principle is good. We just have to restrict it to deterministic contexts, right? So let's go back a few slides. So remember, here's the original transfer of non-responsibility principle. If you're not even partly to blame for the fact that P, and you're also not even partly to blame for the fact that P implies Q, then you're not to blame for Q either. Now she thinks that something like this principle is right on the money, but the trick is we've just got to restrict it a little bit. We've got to restrict it to deterministic context. And she thinks if we do that, cases like double dose won't cause a problem for it, and here's why. She thinks that in cases like double dose, we have to assume that determinism's not true. In other words, we have to assume that when Kathy poisoned Earl at noon, right, that her action was not deterministically caused. She thinks we have to assume that for cases like double dose to provide us with a convincing counterexample to principles like this. And the reason why is she thinks if we assume that determinism were true in the case, then we'd be begging the question at issue, right? So the question at issue is, does determinism rule out moral responsibility? So if we assume that determinism was true in cases like double dose, then to then go on and claim that Kathy is morally responsible for Earl's demise at 12:10 would be to beg the question against the incompatibilist, right? So she thinks we have to assume that that's an indeterministic scenario, the story about double dose. But now, if we restrict this principle to deterministic contexts, then it doesn't apply to the indeterministic context, and so that story can't be a counterexample to the principle once it's restricted to a deterministic context. So she thinks that's how to avoid these problems of two-path cases like double dose. Well, I'm not entirely, well, I don't think that that strategy works, and here's why. Even if the restricted principle, the restricted TNR, is true, right, even if it works in deterministic context, that's not going to help the incompatibilist show that determinism rules out moral responsibility, because in a way that would be for the incompatibilist to beg the question, too, right? So we want a transfer of non-responsibility principle that is neutral on the determinism, indeterminism question. In other words, we want a transfer of non-responsibility principle that we can evaluate independently of whether determinism is true or not. But we can't evaluate Stump's revised TNR principle independently of the question of determinism, because it's a principle that's only supposed to work in deterministic contexts. So in order to evaluate it, we have to assume that determinism is true right from the get-go. So we have to make some controversial assumptions. But notice, my principle says nothing whatsoever about determinism. Right? It can work, I claim, in deterministic scenarios, and it can work in scenarios in which determinism is not true. And so, again, that's another advantage, I think, of this principle, because we can evaluate it independently of the question of whether or not determinism is true. All right, let me say one last thing in defense of this principle, and then I'll move on. Sometimes people complain about compatibilists, so people who think that determinism and moral responsibility are compatible, right? They can go together. They sometimes complain that if we were to find a transfer of non-responsibility principle that was valid, right, that really worked, that was true, it would sort of be little more than the incompatibilist assumption that if our actions are caused by factors beyond our control, then we can't be morally responsible for them. Right? And that principle, you can't really appeal to that claim to defend incompatibilism, because that's just basically what incompatibilism says, is that if our actions are causally determined by factors beyond our control, then we're not to blame for them. But notice, this principle is not equivalent to the incompatibilist claim. This is not incompatibilism. It says nothing about determinism, deterministic causation. Now, I think this principle, together with some other premises, is going to entail the incompatibilist conclusion, but it doesn't assume it right from the get-go. It doesn't beg any questions against the compatibilists. So I think this principle's got a lot going for it. It's not vulnerable to two-path cases like double dose. It's intuitively plausible, and we can evaluate it independently of the question of whether or not our universe is a deterministic system. All right. So now I'm going to take this new transfer of non-responsibility principle, and I'm going to try to use it to argue for incompatibilism, for the claim that determinism rules out moral responsibility. All right, so here are some more abbreviations. Let's let A this time stand for your first action or omission. So that first intentional bit of activity or refraining that you performed, presumably you were very small. You may have even been in the womb when you performed your first action. I don't need to take a stand on when first actions occur. Whatever your first action or omission was, let's let A stand for that. Let's let C stand for the circumstances that led you to perform that action. Right? So C is going to be a big set of circumstances, right? There are going to be a lot of factors that work together to bring about your performing that action. And then let L again stand for the laws of nature. All right, so using these abbreviations, here's a new direct argument for the incompatibilist conclusion. So again, we start out with this claim that necessarily the conjunction of C and L led to A, if determinism is true. So it's a necessary truth, if determinism is true, that the circumstances that led you to perform that action A, together with the laws of nature, result in your performing the action. Well, again, we've got this premise, this claim, no one is even partly to blame for necessary truths. Again, that seems plausible. So it follows that you're not even partly to blame for the fact that C and L jointly led to A, if determinism is true. All right. You're not even partly to blame for C and L. That seems true, right? This is your first action or omission, right? It's your first bit of intentional behavior or refraining. So it seems very plausible to think that you're not responsible for anything that happened before that, right? Since this is your first bit of behavior, and you're not responsible for the laws of nature. Again, those things aren't your fault. All right, so now we have my new transfer of non-responsibility principle, TNR star. You're not even partly to blame for any of the circumstances that led to an outcome, and you're not even partly to blame for the fact that those circumstances led to that outcome, then you're not to blame for the outcome. And together, was that, let's see, 3, 4, and 5 look like they entail 6. So you're not even partly to blame for your first action or omission if determinism is true. Now, this is just an argument about your first action or omission. But it seems like if the argument's a good one, we could then apply very similar arguments to every subsequent action or omission. And so we can thereby arrive at the conclusion that if determinism is true, then you're never to blame for anything you did or failed to do. And if you're never to blame for anything you did or failed to do, it's hard to see how you could be to blame for anything else. All right. Let's see. So I think I've defended, at least I think I've said something about in defense of all of the premises. So I think this argument is a good argument for incompatibilism. Now, there is a little technicality that I guess I should address. Incompatibilism is supposed to be a necessary truth. In other words, what incompatibilism says is necessarily, if determinism is true, then no one's ever morally responsible. It's supposed to be a necessary truth. But necessary truths don't follow from contingently true premises. Right? In order to get a necessarily true conclusion, all of your premises and inference principles have to themselves be necessary truths. But unfortunately, at least some of the premises of this argument are only contingently true. They're not necessarily true. So, number 4, that looks like it's only contingently true. And the reason why it's only contingently true is because the propositions described by C and L are only contingently true. So there are possible worlds in which you're not to blame for C and L. Some such possible worlds are ones in which C and L aren't true, in which there were different past circumstances or in which there were different laws of nature. So, given that this principle is true, but not necessarily true, the conclusion of my argument isn't strictly speaking incompatibilism, right? It's something weaker. It's the claim that if determinism is actually true in our world, then no one is ever morally responsible in our world. And that's a problem. That's a problem with my claim to have proven incompatibilism. Well, what can I say about this problem? Well, I think there are 3 things that I want to say about it. One is just to say that perhaps we could extend this argument to all possible worlds. So perhaps we could just go to any possible world you like and run an argument similar to this and just change the definitions of C and L. So C in those possible worlds would be the actual circumstances in those worlds that led to your action, and L would be the laws of nature in those worlds. And so every possible world that you go to, you could run an argument like this. You just start with an agent's first action or omission. You run the argument, and there we might be able to generate the necessary truth, the claim that necessarily determinism rules out moral responsibility. So perhaps we could actually extend this argument just, in a sense, by going world by world by world, and agent by agent by agent, and action by action by action, and running the argument. And perhaps that would take a very long time, by the way, so I'm not going to do that. But perhaps we could do that. Now, one possible objection to that response is to say, well, what about those possible worlds that contain, human agents like you and I, except the human agents in those worlds have always existed, right? They never had a beginning, right? And they've always been active. In that case, there would be no first action or omission that we could start with. Well, are there any such possible worlds? I don't know. I mean, it's really controversial, right? So some philosophers think that there has to be a beginning in time, right? And if that were true, in every possible world containing agents like you and I, there would have to be a first action or omission, it seems like. So maybe possible worlds with eternally existing agents are not really possible worlds after all. But I don't know about that. That's a tough question, so I don't want to stake anything on that. My second response to this worry that I haven't proved incompatibilism, strictly speaking, is to say, I don't care. And that maybe sounds kind of flippant, but here's why I don't care. Why are we interested in this claim that necessarily, if determinism is true, then no one is morally responsible? Why is that an interesting philosophical claim, that claim of incompatibilism? Well, I suggest that it's interesting precisely because we want to know whether we are morally responsible, right? We want to know whether when we do bad things, people can justifiably blame us, right? Or if our penal system is based on the idea that we should give people what they deserve, we want to know if people really do deserve punishment, right? So the reason why strict incompatibilism is an interesting thesis is because we want to know if we're morally responsible, and it might very well turn out that our world is deterministic. Well, if my argument works, it shows that if determinism is true in our world, then no one's actually morally responsible. So it yields an interesting conclusion that we could apply to our world. And that's the sort of conclusion that I'm interested in. So even if my argument hasn't strictly speaking shown that necessarily if determinism is true, then no one's morally responsible, that would be okay with me as long as I've convinced you that if determinism is actually true, or if it's true in worlds like ours, then no one in worlds like that are morally responsible. Lastly, a last response to this sort of objection is to change the definition of determinism. Right? So some philosophers have recently started to suggest that what we're worried about is not determinism per se, but rather determinism by factors beyond our control. Right? They're two very similar theses, right? But not quite the same. And so if that were true, then I could just say, well, what I'm trying to show is that if our actions are determined by factors beyond our control, then no one is morally responsible. And I think this argument might do a pretty good job of showing that if our behavior is caused by factors beyond our control, then we're not morally responsible for it. All right, so there was an objection to it. Well, it's not really an objection, it's a real problem for my argument, and I'm still trying to work out how to deal with it. But I think the three ways that I've just mentioned give a fairly good go at trying to address the objection. All right. So hopefully by now everyone is a persuaded incompatibilist. Do you think that if determinism is true, then no one is ever morally responsible? All right. So I said earlier that I would tell you why arguments like this are called direct arguments. And the reason why they're called direct arguments is because they try to argue directly from the assumption that determinism is true to the conclusion that no one's ever morally responsible for anything. Without appealing to any claims about free will or free action or freedom to do otherwise or anything like that. None of those phrases, concepts, words appear in these arguments. And that's supposed to be a really good thing. Here's why. So some philosophers will argue for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility like this. They'll say, hey look, if determinism is true, then it's never with anyone's power to do otherwise. Right? So if determinism is true, you couldn't help but show up to my talk tonight. And then they'll make a second claim. They'll say, well look, the power to do otherwise is necessary for moral responsibility. They'll say, you're not morally responsible for what you did if through no fault of your own you couldn't help doing it. So if those two claims are true, if determinism rules out the power to do otherwise, and the power to do otherwise is necessary for moral responsibility, then determinism rules out moral responsibility. That's a sort of indirect argument, and it's indirect because it tries to first establish the incompatibility of determinism and freedom to do otherwise, and then, using that conclusion, argue for the further conclusion that determinism also rules out moral responsibility. But those are controversial steps. It's controversial whether determinism rules out the power to do otherwise. So some people think that even if determinism is true, you can do otherwise. It's up to you. It's also controversial about whether it's also controversial about whether moral responsibility requires the freedom to do otherwise. There are these fancy philosopher stories that I won't tell you about. They're called Frankfurt cases. You can look them up on the web. Some of you are smiling because you've heard about them. And some people, they're supposed to be examples in which a person performs an action and he's morally responsible for it, but he couldn't have done otherwise, right? And so that's supposed to refute the claim that the power to do otherwise is required. I myself am completely unpersuaded by that sort of argument. I used to not be. I used to think it was awesome, but I've since come to see the light that the Frankfurt cases don't work. But this is all controversial business, right? And philosophers spend a lot of time, a lot of ink, a lot of journal pages debating these things. And what's supposed to be nice about the direct arguments is they just sort of bypass all that. It's like a detour, right? We don't have to show that determinism rules out the power to do otherwise, and we don't have to show that the power to do otherwise is required for moral responsibility. We get to avoid these controversies, so this is supposed to have a sort of dialectical advantage. All right, so that's why they're called direct arguments, because they sort of go directly to moral responsibility without going through the intermediary step of talking about freedom to do otherwise. Now, I want to discuss, to conclude, one final objection to this sort of argument. And the objection says, you can't do that. You can't bypass these questions about freedom to do otherwise, right? And here's why they say that. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the freedom to do otherwise is compatible with determinism. And now imagine that determinism is true, and Jones kills Smith. He does it maliciously. He knows what he's doing. He knows that it's wrong. He's not insane. He's not crazy. Neuroscientists weren't messing with his head, right? There's no exculpating considerations, right? It looks like he satisfies all the plausible requirements for moral responsibility. And he could have done otherwise, let's suppose, even though his behavior was determined. Well, then it sounds like he's to blame for what he did. He's morally responsible for his murderous action, if we're assuming that the freedom to do otherwise is compatible with determinism. So what do you do if you're like me and you think that moral responsibility and determinism are not compatible? What do you say about this situation? Well, it looks like you have to say, well, it's not true after all that he could have done otherwise, right? Because if determinism rules out moral responsibility, then it seems like you've got to say that it also rules out the freedom to do otherwise. What else could explain, on my view, why Jones isn't responsible, given that he wasn't crazy, he knew what he was doing, etc. If he could have done otherwise, it seems like we should say that he is morally responsible. So people have taken these sorts of thought experiments to show, no, if you're an incompatibilist about determinism and moral responsibility, then you have to assume that the freedom to do otherwise is also incompatible with determinism. In which case, this sort of argument that I've been defending doesn't really have the sort of advantages we think it has, right? Because we're committed to this claim that the freedom to do otherwise is ruled out by determinism. Well, I don't think this objection works either, and here's why. So, I think it's right that if you're an incompatibilist about determinism and responsibility, you should also be an incompatibilist about determinism and the freedom to do otherwise. I think you are committed to that claim. So, I'm willing to endorse this claim. If determinism and the power to do otherwise are compatible, then determinism is also compatible with blameworthiness. I'm willing to endorse this claim because of stories like I just told you. If we imagine a deterministic world in which Jones kills Smith, he's not insane, he knows what he's doing, and we assume that he could have done otherwise, it seemed to me like he's also morally responsible. So I'm willing to grant that if determinism and the power to do otherwise are compatible, then determinism is incompatible with blameworthiness. But I don't think this undercuts the dialectical significance of my direct argument for incompatibilism. In fact, I think it enhances it. And here's how I think it enhances it. Well, I think the new direct argument I gave establishes this claim, that determinism precludes blameworthiness. I think that's the conclusion of my argument. Well, Together, these two claims entail that determinism and the power to do otherwise are incompatible as well. So, I actually think that my direct argument not only provides us an argument for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility, I also think that once you add this claim right here to it, it also yields an argument for the incompatibility of determinism and the freedom to do otherwise, too. Or you can substitute the power to do otherwise for free will, right? A lot of people think, like me, think that that's just what really free will is. It's very roughly the power to do otherwise. So, all that being said, I think my argument for incompatibilism has a lot of advantages. It improves upon some prior arguments. It relies on intuitively plausible premises. And when you combine it with this first claim up here, you can also turn it into an argument for incompatibilism about determinism and the freedom to do otherwise as well. So that all sounds good to me. I like it. That's it.